God is dead. Not in the way a body dies, but in the way a star burns out, leaving behind a cold, infinite darkness. This sentence, whispered like a curse and shouted like a prophecy, is not a celebration. It is a warning. For centuries, the belief in God was more than faith. It was the backbone of morality, the silent law that told you who you were, what was right, and why you existed. Now that backbone is shattered. The churches still stand, the words of Scripture are still printed in gold, but the collective heart no longer beats for them the way it once did. The sacred authority that told humanity, "You must not and you must," has been dethroned, and in its place is silence. No judge, no cosmic witness, no ultimate why. People think this should be freedom, and maybe it is, but freedom is not always sweet. It is often sharp, cold, and dangerous. Without the old rules, without an unquestioned authority, morality becomes weightless. There is no longer a single map. There are millions of them, each drawn by someone with their own desires, fears, and ambitions. And maps drawn by power are rarely drawn for truth. This is why Nietzsche's statement feels like both a liberation and a death sentence. If there is no God, then the responsibility for meaning, morality, and direction falls entirely on us. But humans are not naturally ready for that kind of responsibility. Most would rather cling to a ready-made truth than face the terror of building one from scratch. And when the old truth dies, the temptation is to replace it quickly. Not with something better, but with something convenient. Look at history. When God left the throne, others fought to sit in it. Ideologies, nations, political movements, economic systems. Each claimed to be the new source of truth. Some promised equality, others promised greatness. But stripped of divine limits, even these human gods became ruthless. They wrote laws to serve themselves, called their will justice, and built their own temples, in palaces, in factories, in banks, in armies. And the average person? They were left drifting in the middle. Without God to watch over them, they were told they were free. But free to do what? Free to chase pleasure until they felt empty. Free to believe in nothing and call it realism. Free to live without purpose and call it survival. The real danger of God is dead isn't the absence of a deity, it's the moral vacuum that follows. A vacuum will always be filled, and if you don't fill it consciously, something else will. Power, money, control, addiction, the worship of the self at the expense of everyone else. And here is the bitter truth. When morality is no longer anchored to something beyond human manipulation, it becomes a tool in the hands of whoever can shout the loudest or threaten the hardest. What is right becomes whatever benefits those in control. What is wrong becomes whatever threatens them. Nietzsche didn't declare God's death to mock believers. He said it to warn everyone, believer or not, that when the highest point of reference disappears, humanity faces a choice. Create your own values with the courage to live by them, or be devoured by someone else's. The question now is, in this godless landscape, where do you place your moral compass? Do you invent your own north, or do you follow someone else's, pretending it's absolute? When the voice of God goes silent, the courtroom of morality doesn't vanish, it mutates. The rules still exist, but they are no longer carved into stone tablets. They are written in sand, easily erased, easily rewritten. And whoever holds the stick decides what gets written. Without a divine anchor, morality stops being eternal and becomes political. What's considered good changes depending on who is in power, what benefits the majority, or worse, what benefits those who manipulate the majority. Today's virtue can be tomorrow's crime. Today's sin can be tomorrow's pride. And if you think that's just philosophy, look at the last century. Regimes rising and falling, each rewriting the moral code to justify their survival. This is the unspoken truth. Without God, there is no universal ought. There is only is, and the powerful decide how to dress it. In practice, morality becomes a negotiation, and negotiations rarely favor the powerless. Laws are passed not for justice, but for convenience. Entire populations are convinced that cruelty is mercy, that exploitation is opportunity, that obedience is freedom. But here's the paradox. The death of God doesn't necessarily make people immoral. It makes morality a matter of choice. And choice is terrifying because it demands ownership. You can't hide behind, "I was just following orders," or "that's just how it's always been." You either take responsibility for your ethics, or you surrender them to someone who will gladly use them for you. And most people, they surrender. Not because they are weak, but because the burden of moral freedom is crushing. When you no longer have a celestial judge, you become your own. Every decision echoes into the kind of person you become, and there is no divine eraser to wipe the guilt away. So many people outsource that weight to governments, to trends, to charismatic leaders, to algorithms that decide what's acceptable and what's not. In this new moral economy, guilt is no longer about sin, it's about breaking the current code. The problem? The current code is unstable. What gets you praised today might get you destroyed tomorrow. It's morality by shifting winds, and those winds blow hardest from the mouths of the loudest. And here's where the world really works in practice. Morality is a currency. If you want influence, you must appear virtuous according to the moment's standards, whether you believe in them or not. This is why hypocrisy thrives. It's easier to look good than to be good. In fact, in a godless landscape, looking good often pays more than doing good. This is the playground for moral opportunists. When there's no ultimate authority, the clever learn to bend every principle into a weapon or a shield. They justify harm as necessity, disguise self-interest as compassion, and wrap ambition in the language of justice. And because there's no divine standard to check them, the only limit is how well they can persuade or intimidate others into agreeing. But there's a deeper consequence. When morality becomes untethered, trust erodes. You never truly know if someone's actions are driven by conviction or by calculation. Friendships, alliances, and even families become transactional. And in a transactional world, you don't love your neighbor because it's right. You treat them well because it's useful. The death of God, then, doesn't just affect personal belief, it changes the entire structure of society. In a godless world, morality is less about truth and more about control. And unless you consciously define your own code and have the courage to live by it, you will be living by someone else's. And they may have designed it with your obedience in mind. So the question isn't simply, what is right and wrong, anymore. The question is, whose right and wrong are you living by? And are you ready to face what it means if the answer isn't your own? If you are liking the content, please like and subscribe so we can keep up. Thank you. When God dies, he leaves behind a throne, and nature hates a vacuum, especially in the human soul. The absence of a supreme judge doesn't produce a clean, empty space. It produces a void that screams to be filled. And that's when the new gods arrive. We imagine ourselves as liberated, free to define meaning for ourselves. But in reality, most people aren't comfortable with that much freedom. Freedom without guidance feels like being set adrift in the middle of the ocean without a compass. So we look for something, anything, to cling to. That's why the death of God is never the end of worship. It's just a change of address. The altar remains, but now it's crowded with idols wearing modern clothes. Political ideologies, celebrity culture, nationalism, science worship, consumerism, technology, they all line up to take the vacant seat. They promise purpose, identity, and community. But they demand obedience, often just as blind as the faith they replace. The irony is brutal. When God dies, faith doesn't disappear. It mutates. We still bow, but to different masters. The human instinct to serve something greater than ourselves is too deeply wired to vanish. And those who understand this become the new high priests of our age. They write the doctrines of consumption, of self-image, of political purity, and we follow them with the same zeal once reserved for prophets. The marketplace becomes the cathedral. Social media feeds become the holy texts, dictating what to believe, what to hate, and what to desire. And instead of fearing eternal damnation, we fear social irrelevance. Instead of heaven, we crave virality. Instead of saints, we have influencers. But there's a darker layer to these new gods. They are not eternal, they are not benevolent, and they do not forgive. Old gods promise salvation if you repented. New gods cancel you forever for the wrong opinion. Old gods asked for faith. New gods demand constant proof of loyalty. Likes, retweets, donations, public displays of virtue. And if you falter, they will erase you without hesitation. This is where the moral instability from part 2 becomes dangerous. Without a transcendent moral anchor, these replacement deities can redefine right and wrong on a whim. They keep their followers anxious, always uncertain if they are still pure enough to belong. The result? A society that lives in permanent fear of being cast out, not from heaven, but from the tribe. And here's the hidden cost. When your God is mortal, your morality becomes disposable. If the leader, movement, or ideology you worship falls, so does your sense of self. You're forced to either betray your identity or cling to a collapsing idol, pretending it still stands tall. But perhaps the most dangerous god of all is the self. When we declare God dead, some choose to crown themselves in his place. They make their own desires the highest law, their own pleasure the ultimate purpose. It sounds like liberation, but it's often just enslavement to impulses, a dictatorship of appetite disguised as freedom. This is why the death of God is not just a philosophical statement. It's a test. It asks, what will you worship now? Because make no mistake, you will worship something. And the quality of that something will shape the kind of person you become and the kind of world you help build. The tragedy is that many never notice they've replaced God at all. They think they've escaped belief, when in reality, they've simply traded one form of obedience for another. The symbols have changed, the rituals have evolved, but the need to kneel remains. The danger isn't in God being dead. The danger is in what rises to take his place. And if you don't consciously choose that replacement, someone else will choose it for you. When God is gone, morality doesn't vanish, it mutates. Without a divine lawgiver, right and wrong are no longer anchored in eternity. They become floating concepts, subject to whoever shouts loudest or holds the most power. And in that vacuum, morality transforms from a shield that protects the weak into a sword wielded by the strong. In the age of God, morality was presented as eternal and unchangeable, carved in stone, immune to negotiation. But once God is dead, the stone tablet shatters, and the fragments are picked up by those with the will to dominate. They redefine morality to serve their own interests. The result is a new kind of tyranny, not the tyranny of brute force alone, but of manipulated virtue. This is why, throughout history, revolutions that begin by rejecting one moral authority often replace it with another, just as rigid and oppressive. The language changes, the symbols are updated, but the mechanism remains the same. Create a moral code, declare it absolute, and punish anyone who refuses to kneel. Power without heaven is naked. It cannot justify itself through divine will, so it cloaks itself in moral necessity. The rulers of this new world must convince the masses that obedience isn't just politically wise, it's morally righteous. Dissent is painted not as disagreement, but as evil. Questioning the new order is framed as a moral failing. And in a world without a higher, untouchable authority, who can say otherwise? The genius and danger of morality as a weapon is that it turns the people into enforcers. You don't need an all-powerful God watching every move when you've trained the mob to watch each other. The modern heretic isn't burned at the stake. They're burned online, their reputation turned to ash, their livelihood erased. And here's the part most people miss. Morality as a weapon always requires an enemy. Without God, heaven, and hell, you can't promise ultimate reward or punishment. So instead, you promise safety from a villain, a group, a class, a scapegoat. And you tell people that by destroying this enemy, they prove their moral worth. It's a brilliant system. Pick an enemy, label them as the embodiment of evil. Convince your followers that eliminating them is a moral duty. Watch as the masses do your work for you. This is why the death of God doesn't guarantee a freer world. In fact, it often creates one more dangerous, because now morality isn't coming from a distant, invisible judge. It's being written by humans with ambition, ego, and flaws. And if you refuse to play by their rules, you're not just wrong, you're immoral. Without heaven above, the ultimate arbiter becomes raw power. Laws bend to influence, morals shift with the political wind, and the concept of justice becomes a moving target. And in such a world, survival often means abandoning the luxury of being truly good, and instead learning to navigate the game without being destroyed by it. But this reality carries a cruel truth. Those who adapt best are often the least bound by conscience. The person willing to weaponize morality without believing in it gains an enormous advantage. They can present themselves as virtuous while pulling the strings behind the curtain, free from the guilt that keeps others restrained. And maybe this is the hardest pill to swallow after the death of God. Morality will still exist, but it will be someone's tool. The question is not whether morality survives, but who gets to write it. The danger is thinking you're free from the old chains, when in reality you're wearing new ones forged by human hands. The symbols on the banners may have changed, but the eyes watching you have only multiplied. God is dead, and with him the illusion that morality was ever written in the sky. But once the thunder fades and the ashes settle, you're left standing in a silent world, without a divine script telling you who to be. And that's when the real weight of freedom hits you. Freedom without a map is terrifying. You can no longer point to heaven and say, "I'm only following orders." There is no celestial court to absolve you, no eternal punishment to fear. Every choice, every failure, every betrayal now belongs entirely to you, and most people can't handle that. They run from it. They trade God for another master, another moral authority, another set of ready-made rules that will think for them. But if you have the courage to resist the urge to kneel, something extraordinary happens. You realize that morality is no longer a cage. It's clay. You can shape it, redefine it, and make it serve life rather than suppress it. This is the path the strong walk when they reject both God and the false gods of men. The first step is to understand the difference between inherited values and created values. Inherited values are handed to you ready-made: family traditions, national myths, political ideologies, religious codes. They feel comfortable because they've been rehearsed for generations. But comfort is not the same as truth. Created values, on the other hand, come from direct confrontation with reality. They are born from your own struggle, your own victories and failures, your own scars. Creating your own law doesn't mean rejecting everything that came before. It means refusing to follow blindly. If a value proves itself useful in the fire of experience, keep it. If it turns out to be a chain disguised as a crown, break it without hesitation. Your moral code must be forged like a weapon, balanced, sharp, and personal. But here's the hard part. Without a divine judge, you are both the lawmaker and the one who must live with the consequences. There's no one to blame if your code fails you. If you decide that loyalty is a virtue and it ends up destroying you, you can't complain to the heavens. You wrote the rule. That responsibility is heavy, but it's the only kind worth carrying. The second step is to accept that morality is not universal. What's right for you may not be right for someone else, and that's not a flaw, it's a fact. Pretending there's one absolute moral law for all humanity is just another way of slipping a crown on someone's head and calling them God. Your law is yours alone, and you will measure your life against it, not against the applause or condemnation of the crowd. And finally, the third step is to live your law without apology. This is where most people fail. They invent their own code, but still crave the validation of the masses. They want to be free, but also loved by everyone. It doesn't work that way. If you live by your own law, some will admire you, some will envy you, and many will hate you. Not because you've done them harm, but because your existence exposes their chains. When God died, the weak prayed for a replacement. The strong understood that there would be none, and that this was the greatest gift ever given. In this world without heaven's eyes, your law is the only law that matters. And the day you stop begging for permission to live by it, you will finally understand what freedom really tastes like. The death of God is not the end of morality. It's the beginning of moral ownership. Most will run from it. A few will embrace it. The question is, which will you be?